Child soldiering is a global issue, and the United Nations reports show that thousands of children are being used as soldiers during armed conflict in most of the countries around the world. They are either recruited as fighters in front line of the armed conflict, or they are used to play the role of spies, messengers, cooks, human shields, suicide bombers, and also they are used for sexual purposes by members of the armed forces or armed groups during armed conflict. The recruitment and use of children in armed conflict is a war crime under international criminal law, international human rights law, international humanitarian law, the Rome Statutes of the International Criminal Court, and the optional protocol to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child on the involvement of children in armed conflict. These children experience extreme violence either as victims of active players or witness of violence. Despite child soldiering is an international war crime, but unfortunately children are still used or recruited by parties to the armed conflicts, including in Afghanistan, as children are used or recruited by parties to the armed conflict. So children who are associated with the armed forces or armed groups should be immediately released from their association with the armed forces or armed groups and should be reintegrated to their communities. So now the question is, if children are reintegrated to their community, how we can make sure that they are not rejoining the armed forces or armed groups. So that needs an economic reintegration services. So these children should be provided with reintegration package services to make sure that they are not rejoining the armed forces or armed groups. But before we start for the reintegration services, let's have a brief look to the United Nations Agenda on Children in Armed Conflict. The United Nations Agenda on Children in Armed Conflict is dated back to 30 years when in 1993 the United Nations General Assembly called for a study on the impact of armed conflict on children. At that time, Gracia Michel was appointed to conduct a comprehensive study on the impact of armed conflict to know the scale of the problem and to work on the protection of these children and to prepare a specific agenda of the United Nations on children in armed conflict. So the report that was completed by Gracia Michel showed that how children were affected by the impact of armed conflict. They were either recruited or used by parties to the armed conflict as soldiers, or they were used in different capacities in the armed conflict. They were also killed or injured directly by the members of the armed conflict, or they were killed or injured indirectly by a landmine, or they were affected by displacement and all other problems arise from armed conflict. The report also showed that children were abducted or sexually abused by parties to the armed conflict. So the United Nations General Assembly responded to that report, and they appointed the United Nations Secretary General Special Representative on Children in Armed Conflict. So at that time, Olara Otono was appointed as Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General on Children in Armed Conflict. So the first is RSG work on the specific agenda of the United Nations on children in armed conflict. The United Nations agenda has three main components. One of the component is the establishment of a monitoring and reporting mechanism on children in armed conflict. So the monitoring and reporting mechanism is being implemented in countries where there is conflict, and that is implemented by the United Nations agencies and also with the partnership of national and international organizations working on children or on human rights issues. So that was the first component. So the second component of the United Nations Agenda on Children in Armed Conflict is the listing and delisting of parties to the armed conflict who have committed the violations against children in the context of armed conflict. Parties who have committed violations are included in the annex of the annual report of the United Nations Secretary General as annex, because the list showed that these parties are responsible for committing violence against children in the context of armed conflicts. And the delisting is when a party signs an action plan with the United Nations and they are committed to not commit any violations against children at least during 1 year, and the country task force of the United Nations report that there is no violations during at least 1 year from that party which is listed, so the country task force can propose that these parties should be delisted. So the United Nations Security Council may decide on the delisting of these parties so they can be removed from the list. And the third component of the United Nations Agenda on Children in Armed Conflict is the creation of the United Nations Security Council Working Group on Children in Armed Conflict. This group is created pursuant to the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1612 of 2005, and the group is reviewing reports on violations against children in the context of armed conflict. So children who are associated with armed forces or armed groups need to be immediately released and separated from armed forces or armed groups, as this is an international war crime. And there should be a strong advocacy to release these children. When they are released, they need to be provided with reintegration support. The reintegration support can be long-term support and short-term support. For the short-term supports, they need immediate and emergency assistance, which may include psychosocial support and legal aid and other support they may need. For the psychosocial support, it can be provided in 3 phases. The first phase can be psychosocial first aid, and that can be provided to all children who are released from armed forces or armed groups, because psychosocial support, first aid support is needed for all children. And the psychosocial first aid can be any step that can help children return to their normal routine of life and normal feeling, to make them forget what happened to them. And the second phase can be psychosocial counseling. The psychosocial counseling can be provided by people who have background of psychology or counseling, but the psychosocial first aid can be provided by any person which doesn't need a professional background, can be provided by social workers, by any child protection actors who have a little bit background of child protection. And then the third phase can be psychiatric intervention. Psychiatric intervention can be provided by a doctor who have authorization of the prescription. So there may be a few children who need psychiatric intervention, and also a few children who may need psychosocial counseling that can be referred to counseling or psychiatric intervention based on their need. So the long-term reintegration services, which I would call them economic reintegration, can be a set of services provided to ex-child soldiers to economically empower them and to prevent their reassociation with the armed forces and armed groups. So if you provide long-term services for these children, they can stay in their community and society, and they can play a positive role in their community and society, and to be able to make some income, so that can prevent their reassociation with the armed forces and armed groups. For the long-term reintegration services, I would recommend the International Labour Organization approach on economic reintegration, which can be provided in 3 phases. The first phase can be preparation, then economic empowerment, and the third phase will be employment post training support for these children. For the preparation phase, we need to have local assessment and identification of the beneficiary. For the local assessment, we need to find which kind of professional thing, vocational training can be for the benefit of these children to be provided with that opportunities. So vocational training, basic education and life skills training, and also entrepreneurship training are needed for these children. Once these activities are provided, they need to be followed up for at least 1 year to make sure that these children are continuing and benefiting from that profession. Then that can lead to self-employment and wage employment to make them economically reintegrated to their society, and to make sure that they are not rejoining the armed forces or armed groups. So for the long-term economic reintegration, we need to have vocational training for the ex-child soldiers. They need to learn skills and to adapt to civilian life in their society, to make sure they make some income and to find job finally. Skills like carpentry, mobile repairing, tailoring, or car repairing can be some of these skills, but this depends on the context of each city and society. And so first we should have an assessment and to make sure that which type of vocational training are for the best interest of these children to make them busy in their society. And then we have a small business opportunity for ex-child soldiers, can be a micro enterprise and apprenticeship support. So you provide some cash for these children, a small business like a small shop or microfinance activities. But in all these activities, education should be the top priority for these children. So all children should be enrolled in school. Some of the children may have left school in some classes, they should resume their education, or some of the children who never been to school, they can start from the beginning. So the UNICEF approach on accelerated learning classes, which is ALC, can be one of the best approach for these children and to make them educated. So once the child is educated and provided with some professional training, they will not rejoin the armed forces and armed groups. They can play a positive role in the society. So let's stand for these children and to work for the release of these children and their smooth and economic reintegration to their societies and communities. Thank you very much.